What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to break down what we learned from every AFC team from 2022 fantasy football. Basically, what I'm going to be doing in today's video is breaking down all the fantasy football takeaways from the AFC side of things, what we thought of each player entering the year, how things ended up playing out, what we can take into next year as a result. Some teams have a lot of takeaways. Some teams have no takeaways. We were right about some things. We were wrong about some things. There's going to be some victory laps. There's going to be some admissions of guilt in this video. So if you guys enjoy, you know what to do. Leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Danny will have the NFC version of this video tomorrow, but we got a lot to get into. So before we get into it, as always, let's hit the intro. All right, so I'm going to go division by division, team by team, break down all these players. On the side of the screen, you guys should be able to see their PPR points per game, where they were being drafted, give or take, and then I'll go through kind of the takeaways, generally speaking, of each team. So we're going to start with the AFC North. We're going to start with the Cincinnati Bengals first. You guys can see PPR points per game. I'm just going to read this off of the first team, and then I'll just leave it on the screen for the rest. Jamar Chase, 20.0 PPR points per game, wide receiver 5 on the season. He was drafted in the mid-first round of drafts in August. T. Higgins, 15.8 PPR points per game, wide receiver 11, drafted in the early third round. Tyler Boyd, 10.3, wide receiver 45, drafted rounds 8 to 10. Joe Mixon, 15.9 PPR points per game, RB8, drafted about the 1-2 turn of drafts. And then Joe Burrow, 22.3 points per game, QB4, drafted around rounds 4 to 6. So we expected the Bengals going into the season to be this great offense, and they were, right? They were pretty much exactly what we expected. There wasn't too much to take away from this team because they were a top 5 points per game scoring offense. They were 4th in offensive DVOA per Football Outsiders. Chase was sensational once he was healthy. Obviously, he missed a couple games, which hurt people, but when he was out there, 4 big time weekly finishes of top 5 performances on the season. T. Higgins was a top 36 receiver in 12 of 15 games, and 2 of those games that he wasn't, he actually posted zeros because he was pretty much inactive, except they didn't actually say he was inactive. So those games don't even really count, although you did put him in your lineup for those games and you lost those weeks probably. But either way, 12 out of 13 healthy games. T. Higgins was a top 36 receiver, Mr. Consistent, definitely the type of guy that you wanted in your lineup. Tyler Boyd and Hayden Hurst gave you some streaming and flex appeal from this team. And Joe Burrow was the architect of the entire passing game, finishing as a top 4 quarterback with a litany of weapons that we knew he had going into the season. I'm sure a lot of you guys that drafted Joe Burrow did very well this year. Joe Mixon was probably the guy that me and Danny were kind of lukewarm on of this offense. We pretty much liked everybody else at their ADP. We didn't love Joe Mixon at the 1-2 turn. We didn't hate Joe Mixon at the 1-2 turn. We kind of thought he was pretty much appropriately priced, but for the most part, we might let our league mates draft him because, there was risk that came along with him. He provided you with a monster week 9 game this year with 55.1 PPR points on the back of 5 touchdowns that he scored. But outside of that game, he exceeded 15 PPR points just 5 of 13 other games that he played. So given that he was a running back who always had a risk of getting injured because he had a lot of carries under his belt, I'd say the RB8 finish that you got out of Joe Mixon wasn't quite what you were hoping for, but it wasn't a huge disappointment either. So again, pretty much just he hit his median projection. He hit his median range of outcomes with Joe Mixon. I think his ceiling probably would have been another top 5 season on the back of a lot of touchdowns. He only had, I believe, 9 or 10 touchdowns on the season this year. Did get a little bit banged up at one point, but definitely a solid season overall from Joe Mixon. The Cincinnati Bengals, again, pretty much what we saw is what we got from the season and the preseason combined. So Cleveland Browns, there was a lot more takeaways from this team because I would say probably more than any other AFC team, the most things that we got wrong came from this team. And specifically me, I think, for a lot of these, the Cleveland Browns, Amari Cooper, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Deshaun Watson, etc. We were a lot more wrong on this team than probably most of the others in this conference. And I think it all kind of stems from the same reason. It's that I didn't think Jacoby Brissett was going to be very good. I didn't think he was going to definitely not lead this offense to the 7th in DVOA offense pre-Deshaun Watson coming back from his suspension. And Jacoby Brissett, I didn't expect to be the 7th highest graded quarterback according to PFF. If you guys recall, one of the big reasons I was fading Nick Chubb, and we were fading Nick Chubb, is that he was limited by opportunity because he was splitting a backfield with Kareem Hunt, which definitely was still true. He still was just a 55.7% snap share running back in an offense led by a journeyman quarterback. So generally speaking, I think the process was probably sound there. But Nick Chubb obviously made us look very stupid because Nick Chubb is a very good running back. He was the RB7 for the time that Jacoby Brissett was the starting quarterback. The one thing that I will say against Nick Chubb that we said coming into the season was that Nick Chubb is probably not going to finish as a top 5 running back. He has never done that feat in his illustrious career so far, never going to get that 20 plus PPR points per game score ceiling that we want out of our running backs when we draft them early. So overall, we were wrong on Nick Chubb. He was definitely a good pick if you drafted him in the mid-second round or whatever, in the sense that he was very safe and his median range of outcome hit. But the ceiling factor was valid, and that's why we weren't drafting him. So I would say we were wrong on Nick Chubb from the fact that we faded him and we never got any shares of him, but we were also right on the fact that he didn't have this outrageous ceiling that we want out of our fantasy running backs in the first couple rounds. And I can stomach that. With Joe Mixon and with Nick Chubb finishing as RB7 and RB8 respectively, I think I can handle those guys hitting at that point. They didn't kill me, right? They weren't the RB1 overall, and I faded them into oblivion like some of these other guys might have been. So the other thing that we were wrong about from this offense was the dynamic of the receiving game. We expected, David Bell to be a great sleeper, Amari Cooper to be kind of disappointing, Donovan Peoples-Jones to be a decent sleeper. And that was not at all what played out. It was Amari Cooper and everybody else. We flat out missed on Amari Cooper. Our argument against him was that he never had been a high target share player, which I think was a valid concern given that he was in the league for like 7 years and he had never exceeded like a 23-24% target share. So I didn't expect a year 8 wide receiver to suddenly be a 30% target share guy. I think part of the reason that this came to fruition and why he had such a great season was that his health was probably the best it's been throughout the entirety of his career. Amari Cooper was on the injury report just one time this entire season. And we've heard Amari Cooper himself come out and say that, when I'm healthy, I'm one of the best receivers in the league. And we've seen, spurts and stretches of play where Amari Cooper has put up very, very high level production, but it's never been sustained for an entire season because, sometimes he's dealing with a hamstring injury or plantar fasciitis or whatever the case is. But I think overall, him being healthy led to the fact that he was a top 15 receiver in points per game. Definitely a guy that was a value in drafts. So if you drafted him in the 6th, 7th round, where he was going. And I think finally with this offense, Kareem Hunt's standalone role was virtually overvalued. We expected him to be, at least a flex play with Nick Chubb in tandem there. And that really wasn't how it played out. He was virtually useless outside of a Nick Chubb injury, which never ended up coming to fruition. Like I said, one of my biggest sleepers, David Bell, was outshined by Donovan Peoples-Jones, who on the depth chart, who I expected the inverse to happen. I expected David Bell to kind of have the season that Donovan Peoples-Jones had, and I'm losing faith in David Bell from like a dynasty perspective. Very poor rookie season, 112th ranked wide receiver out of 118 per PFF. And then I think David Njoku was the one piece of this offense that we kind of hit on, where we expected David Njoku to be a great, sleeper tight end, a guy that, Brissett would kind of draw and gravitate towards. And before his injury, he was one of the best tight ends in fantasy. And then when he came back, he provided some spike weeks as well. So I think, mixed bag with the Cleveland Browns, some hits, some misses. We can move on to the next team, the Pittsburgh Steelers. This season kind of went as expected for the Pittsburgh Steelers, kind of like Cincinnati. I don't think there was a ton of takeaways for this team. We expected a bad offensive line. It actually was more like below average. So their offensive line was a little better than we expected. 21st in run blocking, 14th in pass blocking. The guy I was grabbing everywhere from this team was Diontae Johnson, who, if you told me preseason that Diontae Johnson would have a 26.6% target share, command 137 targets in 16 games, I would have grabbed him everywhere. I would have continued to draft him. I loved him coming into the season in the 4th round. The problem with Diontae Johnson was that he had one of the most historically inefficient seasons we've ever seen from a wide receiver. 6.2 yards per target. The fact that he didn't score a touchdown despite having 137 targets this year, the NFL record right now for the most targets without a touchdown. This one will pretty much, we're going to chalk up to process over results. You don't want to do that every time you miss on somebody, but I think Diontae Johnson is a warranted case because if you get 137 targets out of most receivers, 99% of the time, you're going to get at least a top 24 receiver, if not a top 15, top 12 type of wide receiver. So Diontae Johnson, historically inefficient season, but definitely the volume was the argument I liked for him, and he still got the volume. It just didn't work out. Najee Harris was the big bust from this team, I would say, if there was one, and the signs were there. This was not a guy that we were high on coming into the season, so I think we got this right. The only thing that Najee Harris had to hang his hat on in his rookie year was volume, and after leading the NFL in snap share, leading the NFL in opportunity share, leading the NFL in targets at the running back position, weighted opportunities as a rookie, he fell down to top 15 across the board, which is still fine volume, but given that Najee Harris wasn't efficient, wasn't a guy that was going to be really productive and break off long runs. We had reason to believe that may have happened due to what they said in training camp in the preseason. I'm glad we faded this guy. As soon as we started hearing that stuff, I was all the way out on Najee Harris. So definitely a good one there. George Pickens showed flashes for sure. And all in all, I think it was an effective rookie season for his like dynasty value because I think he's increased his value. But a 67.9 PFF receiving grade, ranked in the 60s at wide receiver this year, a 15.3 target share and 15.9 targets per route run with a 1.65 yards per route run still gives me pause about George Pickens long term. I don't think he's necessarily going to all of a sudden become DK Metcalf. I think he screams more DJ Chark than DK Metcalf than anything. And you guys know I wasn't high on George Pickens leading back to his time at Georgia. He's pretty much been exactly as I anticipated. I thought, people who are George Pickens stands, it seems a little surprising to me that they think his rookie season was a success when I think it was a little bit more in the median range of outcomes, kind of exactly what I expected given his college profile at Georgia. So moving on to the Baltimore Ravens, the final team of this division. In the 12 full healthy games that we saw from Lamar Jackson, the Ravens were a top 5 offense in DVOA. So obviously injuries played a big time part from this team being underwhelming, I would say, generally speaking. Lamar, Dobbins, Andrews, Bateman, pretty much everybody missed time here and there, and we didn't get a lot of these games where all these guys were on the field at the same time. The big takeaway for me is as good as Travis Kelce was this year, the inverse side of the coin was Mark Andrews, right? Travis Kelce was, a clear advantage at the tight end position, but Mark Andrews was going shortly after him. And Mark Andrews only averaged 12.7 PPR points per game, which was not much more productive than late round guys like Pat Freiermuth and Evan Ingram. So I was concerned about pass volume going back down with the running backs coming off of injury, and that definitely came to fruition. The Ravens were not nearly as pass heavy when Lamar was on the field as they were in 2021 when Mark Andrews had his tight end one season. J.K. Dobbins was my biggest miss of this offense, I would say for sure. He looked exactly like a running back coming off of the first year of an ACL tear, a compound ACL tear at that. And to be honest, he's now the last straw for me. You're never going to hear me say again, he's a young running back. And it happened, 11 months ago. He has plenty of time to recover. No, running backs coming off of ACL tears is a bad idea. I was wrong on J.K. Dobbins. First year off the ACL tear is something that you just want to let your league mates deal with. And that's going to be very applicable this year, given that we have Javonte Williams coming off of pretty much exactly the same injury that J.K. Dobbins suffered, a compound ACL tear on contact. And we have a non-contact ACL tear with Breece Hall. Both guys, young running backs, second year and third year running backs respectively. It's a similar argument to J.K. Dobbins, but I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to fall for it again. I'm going to let these guys slide. If they fall to the 6th, 7th round, sure, but I'm not going to draft them in the 3rd, 4th round like I was willing to do with J.K. Dobbins at one point. I started to cool on that stance a little bit as we got into August and close to the preseason and to the NFL season, but still, I was a little too high on J.K. Dobbins, and that one's on me. Rashad Bateman is also at a breaking point for redraft and for dynasty. We haven't seen a ton of great target earning production to speak of yet. 2 seasons marred with injuries so far. Will definitely be interesting to see how he stacks up in ADP going forward. The only positive to point to with Rashad Bateman is the 25.5% targets per route run that he displayed this year. Wasn't a full-time player, wasn't a guy that was running like 90% of the Ravens routes. So that's like the creak in the door that's still open right now, plus the prospect profile that we had for Rashad Bateman as a first-round guy with a good, analytics profile and stuff. So moving on to the AFC West, and I'll try and speed these up a little bit. We have the Kansas City Chiefs. Admittedly, I was fading Patrick Mahomes at his cost. He was a 3rd-round pick, probably stupid in hindsight, and I'm not going to claim process over results because the process should have led me to Patrick Mahomes because Patrick Mahomes is potentially the best quarterback we've ever seen, at least so far in his career, the sample size that we have. The only real takeaway is that I really don't care that he lost Tyreek Hill. He's still Patrick freaking Mahomes. I should have still been drafting him where he was going. Travis Kelce, another big miss for me on this offense. I didn't end up with him virtually anywhere. And it's not that I didn't love Travis Kelce, the player, and think that he was going to be good and an advantage at the tight end position. I just thought he was going a little bit too high. I would have rather him gone, at the 2-3 turn area rather than the 1-2 turn where he ended up going. And I personally passed on him twice in my home league draft at the 1-2 turn where I was picking. He had concerns like being a 33-year-old tight end entering the season. The point I made about Andrews needing to be the clear difference maker at that position is still valid in my opinion. When you draft a tight end that high, they better be as good as Travis Kelce was this year. But the issue is that on a micro player takes level, I goofed, right? We should have seen this coming. Tyreek Hill was no longer there. The offense was going to funnel through Travis Kelce. No signs of decline the previous year and a future Hall of Fame talent. Like the signs were there. I should have been higher on Travis Kelce than I was. This was definitely not a process over results. My process was wrong, and I will definitely admit that. I will not make that mistake with Travis Kelce next year if the same kind of peripherals line up. Juju Smith-Schuster was pretty much exactly as I suspected. We kind of were really out on Juju at first because people were saying things like he has wide receiver 1 upside. And then people started to realize that maybe he doesn't quite have that kind of upside. I thought he was a solid wide receiver 3 if you wanted to draft him in the mid rounds because he plays with Mahomes. He was going to have some weeks, but I didn't get the whole wide receiver 1 type of ceiling. And I'm glad he didn't burn us that bad for sure. But Juju was a guy that I think we were kind of lukewarm on as well. Sky Moore was worth the dart throw as a solid prospect in a great offense. Only thing you can hang your hat on for Sky Moore's rookie season from a dynasty perspective is 22.1% targets per route run. But him not being able to get on the field is definitely a concern and what probably should have led us to fade him coming into the season. So moving on to the Los Angeles Chargers. Again, this is another team where things pretty much played out exactly as we expected. In the minimal games where Eckler, Herbert, Keenan Allen, and Mike Williams were all out on the field together, we saw the top 5 unit that this offense could be. We thought it was going to be the entirety of the season, of course, because we assume health coming into the year, but they lose their all-pro left tackle, Rashawn Slater. They lose Keenan Allen for like 6 games. They lose Mike Williams for a couple games. Justin Herbert was dealing with a rib injury in the midpoint of the season. They won all 5 games that all 4 of those guys were out there for. So I would say bounce back candidate alert next year will be Justin Herbert because he was playing with a lot of his weapons dealing with injuries. Keenan Allen was the guy that I was personally highest on from this offense. I had the most exposure to him in best ball drafts. He was one of my highest owned receivers on Underdog. And I think had he not suffered that hamstring injury at the beginning of the year, it was in the first game that he ended up doing that. I think we would have seen a much better season out of Keenan Allen, probably a season where he was, 16 to 18 PPR points per game, probably a top 12 receiver. And definitely Justin Herbert would have had a better year if that happened as well. I think he was the biggest disappointment from this offense because you probably drafted him in the 5th, 6th round, maybe even passed on, a Joe Burrow or a Jalen Hurts who ended up being big time hits for Justin Herbert. I still think he's going to be fine going forward, a good bounce back candidate next year. So moving on to the Denver Broncos, and man, there was a lot that went wrong with this offense. I'd say the Broncos offense was a big time miss for pretty much the entire fantasy community in general. But I think us at FSE, we probably missed a little bit less than most people because if you guys recall, we were not sold on this offense being, the best offense in the league. We were not sold on them at cost because you had to pay up for the potential that this transition went very smoothly and Russell Wilson, this future Hall of Fame quarterback, comes in, elevates the play of Sutton, of Judy, of Javonte, of Gordon, everybody that we were drafting pretty highly. The guys we loved personally at FSE were Javonte Williams and Jerry Jeudy. Javonte obviously tore his ACL. Had he stayed healthy, we saw how Melvin Gordon fell out of favor with the team. I think Javonte Williams would have been great this year, and I think he would have scaled his production as the season went along. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see that because he got injured. Jerry Jeudy, on the other hand, posting a top 30 wide receiver season under this mess of circumstances, dealing with injuries of his own, is mighty impressive in my opinion. And we were on the right side of Jeudy versus Sutton because Jeudy outscored Sutton this year, which, by the way, wasn't the consensus entering the year. Sutton was actually going higher in drafts than Jerry Jeudy was, so I'm glad we were on the right side of that discussion. Courtland Sutton showed his kind of like fake alpha self with only a 22% target share. He was uber inefficient on most of his targets, and he had a few spike weeks early in the season, but pretty much was dead in the water after that. Russell Wilson just flat out sucked. I really don't know what to say about this offense. I don't know if it's fixable going forward in the long term. I don't know if it was coaching. I don't know if it was Russ. I think it's just a combination of everything. He was equally as much of a problem as Nathaniel Hackett, in my opinion. So definitely not encouraging going forward for dynasty perspective. But I would say the takeaway was overall, I'm glad I kind of avoided this offense at cost and kind of recognized what the downside risk was without, blindly going into this and just drafting all the Denver Broncos. The Las Vegas Raiders, the next team that we're going to talk about here, I can't honestly point to what went wrong with the Raiders outside of Derek Carr, really, who was the 28th graded passer according to PFF. The line was solid. They were top 15 in pass blocking, in run blocking. The main 2 weapons were great with Adams, with Jacobs. You didn't get much from Darren Waller or Hunter Renfrow this season, but I think it was mainly Derek Carr's fault this year. This is unexpected considering Derek Carr. I would say going into the year, if you would have told me Derek Carr was the problem here, I would have said you're probably crazy because he just come off his career best season. He was a top 15 graded quarterback and had his best year in 2021 statistically. Maybe it was pressure of feeding a number 1 receiver like Devontae Adams. I really don't know. The big hits for us at FSE were Adams absolutely being worth the late first round pick that he was going at. Me and Danny got a lot of Devontae Adams. Renfrow was overvalued. We weren't getting any of Hunter Renfrow. And we also thought Jacobs was a good value at his ADP as well, the more he started to fall. Josh Jacobs, obviously one of the biggest league winners in fantasy this year, which nobody, including me, who repeatedly said, it's possible that Josh Jacobs is this year's Joe Mixon. I said that on numerous occasions, and even I didn't expect Josh Jacobs to be as good as he was this year. The process was there, though. Contract year, best offense on paper that he had played with in his career, with Devontae Adams coming in and company, drawing attention away from the box, leading to light boxes. He was a great running back. He had finished as a top 15 guy in 3 straight years to open his career. Finally, as a top 3 season this year. Darren Waller got injury marred for the 2nd straight season. In 2021, he was also pretty much useless due to injuries, and he was even more ineffective this year in the healthy games that he played than he was in the games that he played in 2021. He's really going to need to come at a discount for me in drafts next year and in dynasty leagues if I'm buying back in, because Darren Waller is just, he's been really dealing with injuries, and it's become a problem for him. So definitely a lot of takeaways from the Raiders there. Miami Dolphins, moving on to the AFC East side of things. We see Tyreek, Waddle, Edmonds, Gesicki, all the guys that were drafted on this team. The Dolphins offense, another offense that I probably should have been a little bit higher on. I think part of the reason why I wasn't like higher on the Dolphins offense was because I think the offense in general was priced very fairly across the board in drafts. Tyreek Hill should have been a mid-second round pick, early second round pick type of area. That's exactly where he was going. So there wasn't really any discourse, any argument to talk yourself more into Tyreek Hill, because he was pretty much priced exactly where he should have been priced the entire process. And same goes for Jalen Waddle. He should have been going in the 4th round. He went in the 4th round. I wish I had Waddle ranked higher than some of the guys like DJ Moore and Diontae Johnson, who I ended up drafting both over Jalen Waddle in my home league going into the season. And in hindsight, we need to start thinking about these mid-round wide receivers and favoring guys that play in better offenses. And that sounds very simple and very easy to do in practice. But when you have a guy like Diontae Johnson or a guy like DJ Moore, guys like Terry McLaurin, who have been very productive, we know they're great players. We know that they can command high target shares. It's hard to pass on them for guys that we need to expect efficiency from, like Jalen Waddle, because of Tyreek Hill entering the fray. So it's definitely something that I'm going to need to be more aware of going into next year's drafts. I favored the target share earning ability of those other guys and didn't take into account enough the schematic advantages that the Miami Dolphins presented to opposing defenses, because it was, clearly a problem for defenses. When Tua was back there throwing the ball, he was playing like a top 5 quarterback passing the football, and Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle were clearly elite wide receivers that were elevating his play. 8.9 yards per attempt, 6th graded passer per PFF. I wish I got more shares of Tua Tagovailoa as well. The one thing I did get right about this team was not to invest in Chase Edmonds. I was not taking any shots on Chase Edmonds where he was going. He was like your prototypical dead zone running back, in my opinion, towards that tail end 6th, 7th round where he was going. I was much more likely to take guys like Raheem Mostert and Sony Michel from this backfield later on in drafts, and Raheem Mostert ended up being the guy that you wanted to draft from here. And silly me, I didn't really make the connection between Raheem Mostert and Mike McDaniel a little bit more, but I knew, if Raheem Mostert can stay healthy, he's probably the most talented of these running backs. So definitely a mixed bag from the Miami Dolphins. We can move on to the New York Jets, and this is where I'm going to eat some crow, obviously. You guys know that perhaps the biggest whiff of my entire fantasy prognosticating career so far has been Zach Wilson. I clearly was wrong about Zach Wilson. Dynasty-wise, I liked him as QB2 in that class. I thought he was a good prospect. I thought he had the tools. I thought he showed, some toughness. I thought he showed confidence. I thought he had the ability to be the next like Joe Burrow kind of quarterback. And the weapons, the protection, the scheme, the coaching around him was all setting up for him to have a great season. The only issue is it's a mental issue for him. He clearly can't get there mentally. He clearly can't get there from a talent perspective. I will point to this process, though, being exactly what led to Tua Tagovailoa and Jalen Hurts having breakout seasons this year. So I will say the process of having great weapons, having great coaching, watching a player take some steps who has tools, it would have led you to draft guys like Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa. Unfortunately, it would have also led you to guys like Zach Wilson subsequently. So also we had Elijah Moore, who was another big-time disappointment in fantasy this year. And I don't know if it was pure frustration with the quarterback, but the coaching staff really punished Elijah Moore for voicing that kind of displeasure, limiting his playing time for the most part in the middle portion of the season. I still have hope for Elijah Moore next year and in Dynasty, but they really got to figure out the quarterback position, whether it's a Jimmy Garoppolo, a Derek Carr, somebody else. Elijah Moore commanded almost 6 targets a game when he was out there on 70+% of the snaps. So he was still out there commanding targets, but he definitely wasn't as electric as he was as a rookie. So something that he's going to need to, work through going forward. Maybe this is a Brandon Ayuk situation where, he has a great rookie year, down second year, breaks out in his third year. Maybe that's what Elijah Moore does. We will have to find out. Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall were the shining stars of this offense when Breece Hall was healthy. Breece Hall will undergo a grueling rehab from an ACL tear, and I'm likely going to be out on him, like I said, with J.K. Dobbins. I just don't want to pay a 3rd, 4th round cost where I think Breece Hall is going to end up going for a guy coming off of a compound ACL tear. Garrett Wilson was a massive hit, though. If you guys drafted him in the 8th to 10th round, I had many shares of him in best ball, paid off very nicely from the top 10 pick wide receiver that he was. Any rookie wide receiver with 5 games of 90+ receiving yards, 8+ targets in over half of his games is definitely someone you want to invest in long-term in Dynasty as well. So definitely be investing in Garrett Wilson in Dynasty. Taking shots on a great prospect despite a potentially bad landing spot was absolutely the right process for Garrett Wilson. So definitely kudos to those of you guys that invested in him. The Buffalo Bills, I can just skim through this really fast because there's very few takeaways from this Bills passing game. Entering the year, we expected certain things to go a certain way. Josh Allen to be a top 3 quarterback. That absolutely happened. Stephon Diggs to be a top 6 wide receiver. That absolutely happened. Gabriel Davis to be a boomer bust wide receiver 3, who's going to give you some top 20 weeks. He had 4 of them this year. Very few weeks where he ranked inside the top 35 for some consistency. He was mostly either he hit big or he disappointed. He had 8 games outside the top 40 wide receivers, 8 of his 14 to be exact. The backfield was really the interesting part coming into the season for Buffalo. The interesting thing for me was knowing that Devin Singletary was probably going to get the early down work. He was a guy that I was heavily investing in towards the end of August and early September. I thought he was a great value on Underdog, so I got a lot of shares of him, and that definitely worked out because he finished as a top 30 running back this year. James Cook, I expected to get some pass catching work that didn't really materialize until later on in the season, but I expected a lot of his value was going to come as, ambiguous second round running back. At least he's going to be the handcuff for Devin Singletary, and unfortunately, Devin Singletary didn't miss any games, so we didn't get to see that materialize, but overall, I think the process was decent on him. Moving on to the New England Patriots, the final team of this division. The only real decision point in this team was the Patriots running backs, right? We didn't know what to do with rhamondre Stevenson or Damian Harris early on in the offseason. As the offseason went along, we started to get more and more clarity. I'm sure, Jacoby Myers was a guy that some people liked as a solid sleeper, target share truthers especially. Definitely would have gotten some late round exposure to him, and I think we were probably on that side as well. But rhamondre Stevenson versus Damian Harris was the real discussion. Rhamondre, process-wise, would have led you to the breadcrumbs that led you to the top 12 season that rhamondre Stevenson had. He was a guy that was the better pass catcher, right? Top 5 target share in the NFL this year at the running back position. We also heard throughout training camp, throughout the preseason, that he was going to be the lead back. And if you listen to that stuff and you recognize the fact that he was the better pass catcher, then that would have led you to draft him in the 6th, 7th, 8th round where he was going. We knew Damian Harris wasn't going to contribute on third down, and that's why Stevenson was the smarter pick, and it worked out to the tune of an RB1 season for rhamondre Stevenson. I'm sure a lot of you guys that drafted him probably did very well in your fantasy leagues this year. Hunter Henry was the final guy of this offense that was kind of relevant. He was a sleeper tight end of mine, but Mac Jones regressing as a passer was a big time problem for Hunter Henry's passing touchdown output because I thought he was going to catch a lot of touchdowns and Mac Jones was not that good this year. So definitely you could have just cut bait with him and streamed going forward. So moving on to the final division, and this has probably the least amount of takeaways of any division because it's the worst division in the AFC. We have the Jacksonville Jaguars leading off the AFC South. Kind of a wonky season for Travis Etienne, who was the highest drafted player from this team. Entering the year, we expected DeAndre Swift type of ascension for Travis Etienne, right? We expected potentially a guy that could command a top 5 target share at the running back position, but he only had 43 targets this year. He was the RB17 from week 5 on when James Robinson fell out of favor with the team. I would say this was kind of like the median range of outcomes for Travis Etienne, a top 24 type of finish. I think next year we could still see more upside. We could still see more targets. We could see more big runs like we saw a couple weeks ago. We could see more red zone touches with the offense getting better, with Trevor Lawrence still progressing, Calvin Ridley entering the fold. I think definitely Travis Etienne is going to be a guy that I'm high on next year. And speaking of Trevor Lawrence, he was another big development of this team. Obviously, he went as the team went. I was admittedly a little too low on Trevor Lawrence from a dynasty perspective because I didn't know if he was guaranteed to take a big step this year. I was falling under the illusion of the Urban Meyer situation. It spooked me a little bit to the point that, I was cautiously optimistic for Trevor Lawrence. I wanted to see the guy that I scouted at Clemson, but I didn't know for sure if the guy was going to take a huge step. And he definitely had some up and down play this year, but to close out the season, he's been absolutely spectacular. He's been one of the best quarterbacks in the league. So Trevor Lawrence, definitely a big time hit if you guys drafted him or picked him up on the waiver wire midway through the season. Christian Kirk, however, was one thing that I was definitely right about coming into this season from this team. The rationale was pretty simple. A top of the league passing volume offense was the main draw of Christian Kirk, a guy that was paid to be the number 1 wide receiver of this team, and more importantly, a guy that showed he can command targets and be productive in Arizona the year before. So it's not like I was just following the money for a guy that, wasn't very good. Christian Kirk was a top 30 fantasy wide receiver in Arizona alongside DeAndre Hopkins the year before. So going to a team like Jacksonville that was going to pass the ball a lot, that had a young ascending quarterback, there was the possibility that Christian Kirk could be a top 15 receiver this year. And he wasn't necessarily a top 15 receiver, finished top 21 in fantasy, but there was definitely points in time where his value was that high and you could have traded him for better options if you wanted to. So Evan Ingram, Zay Jones, a couple other guys from this offense that had good years. I took some late round shots in best ball, but that was pretty much it. We can move on to the Indianapolis Colts, and there's pretty much only two fantasy relevant guys entering the year, and they were both going high, right? Jonathan Taylor was the 101. He was my 101, so obviously that didn't work out if you drafted him. Rationale being that, Jonathan Taylor was one of the best running backs in the league. The offense would at least improve a little bit, if not stay the same, with Matt Ryan coming in. And the offensive line was intact, so you knew that, Jonathan Taylor could average 5 yards a carry. He could get a lot of carries in the red zone. They were going to be effective on those carries because he's a great running back, and the offensive line was great. Pretty much the wheels fell off. JT got hurt. The offense wasn't very good. The quarterback play sucked. The offensive line underwhelmed. The wide receivers underwhelmed. The coaching was subpar. Pretty much everything that could have gone wrong with Indianapolis this year did. And that was something that I wasn't expecting. I'm sure a lot of you guys weren't expecting that as well. And that includes Michael Pittman Jr. as well, who was somebody I was extremely high on coming into the year on the basis that Matt Ryan would at least be as good as Carson Wentz. I thought the quarterback play, at the very minimum, is going to stay the same, if not get a little bit better. Definitely took that one on the chin. So these two guys were definitely big time misses for people. The Indianapolis Colts, not an offense that bared a lot of fruit for fantasy. Alec Pierce was like a late round guy that some people were interested in. Sure, if you took some shots on him, he was fine. But for the most part, not a guy that you could use consistently. Then we move on to the Tennessee Titans, pretty much as expected in Tennessee. My concern was going into the year, Derrick Henry is an older running back. He has a lot of touches under his belt. He was injured the year before, but we were making concessions for Christian McCaffrey for similar reasons, right? Older running back, a lot of injuries, a lot of touches under the belt. If we were going to make those concessions for Christian McCaffrey, we also had to make them for Derrick Henry, because Derrick Henry, in his time in the NFL, has proven that he's a borderline Hall of Fame caliber running back. So you have to give him the benefit of the doubt. And again, a little weird that I gave those concessions to Derrick Henry, but not to Travis Kelce at the tight end position, because they were similar arguments, in my opinion. I'll take Henry if he slides. Late round one was kind of my attitude entering the year, but not much higher than that. So Derrick Henry, I may have missed on in some leagues, but I didn't actually have the opportunity to draft him really anywhere, because I either drafted really early or I drafted really late. He was either off the board or I wasn't going to draft him that high. So Derrick Henry, probably a guy that you hit on if you drafted him in like the 5th, 6th, 7th pick in your fantasy drafts this year, but definitely a guy that I think I was pretty much at market value with going into the year. Treylon Burks was a big time target of mine in the mid rounds. If it wasn't for injury in week 5, I think we may have seen a big time rookie season out of Treylon Burks. 75.1 PFF receiving grade, was top 25 at wide receiver, and was actually 4th highest among rookie wide receivers, behind only Chris Olave, Drake London, and Garrett Wilson. It was actually higher than George Pickens, Jahan Dotson, and Christian Watson. So pretty good grade for Treylon Burks out of his rookie season. 23.6% target rate per route run as well. Also solid for a part-time player. I think he's a great buy in dynasty leagues right now, because everybody's scared about the Titans situation, about Treylon Burks' injuries. And, he didn't necessarily look as flashy as guys like Pickens and Watson did. So some people are a little bit lower on him. And I think you could trade both of those guys straight up in a dynasty league for Treylon Burks in some situations. So the Houston Texans, the final team that we're going to talk about in this video, again, not a very good team. We expected them to be bad coming into the season. We knew they had a good shot at picking at the 1st overall pick, which is, it looks like, where they're going to pick in the NFL draft this year. The only real fantasy relevant discussions we had for this team were about Dameon Pierce and Brandon Cooks. And Pierce was, again, somebody to follow the breadcrumbs for. I had him personally graded as a top 5 running back entering the 2022 NFL draft. So I definitely feel good about that grade, knowing that I hit on a guy who had a very bad production profile. He was not productive at all at Florida, but he had great film. If you watch the film on Dameon Pierce, you knew he was a good player. He had a great camp. He had a great preseason. Process would have led you to the fact that, drafting him in the 6th, 7th round where he ended up going, maybe a little bit earlier, depending on your league. I'm glad I was on the right side of Dameon Pierce, because he's definitely a good running back, going to have a career in the NFL for a long time. How long will he be the clear-cut starter for Houston? We don't exactly know, but definitely a guy that's a good player at the very least. Brandon Cooks was a guy that I was fading heavily. I liked him 2 years ago in 2021 when he was left for dead. He was like a 10th, 11th, 12th round pick. And at that point in time, I felt like it was worth the risk of a guy that could finish as like a top 25, top 30 wide receiver. But I think his upside was similar this year, top 25, top 30 wide receiver. The only issue was that's where his ADP was. He was pretty much going in the 6th, 7th, 8th round, where you had to pass on guys like some of the rookies like London, like Olave, like Garrett Wilson, like Treylon Burks, or guys like Tyler Lockett or Christian Kirk as well. So I just wasn't in on Brandon Cooks. I was going to let my league mates draft him. And that definitely worked out because he finished outside the top 40 wide receivers. So that is the end of the video. I feel like I got way more wrong in the AFC than we did in the NFC. So hopefully Danny will be a little bit more positive in tomorrow's video. But basically, we're just being honest here, right? We're looking, hard look in the mirror. What were we saying about these players entering the year? What ended up happening? And what can we take out of this season? Because if we don't do that, that's how you get complacent. That's how you become a worse fantasy player. And even someone like myself, who's been playing fantasy a long time, I feel like I've gotten a lot of things right. I feel like I've gotten a lot of things wrong, but it's up to us to take that information into next season so that we can hit on that sleeper that we missed on. We can or we can avoid drafting that bust that ended up killing a bunch of people's seasons and all that good stuff. And if you don't believe any of the things I said in this video, go ahead and check the receipts. We have YouTube videos galore of stuff that we were higher on, stuff that we were lower on, that you guys can go fact check on us if you want to. Certain things we got right, certain things we got wrong. That's how fantasy football goes. Friday, we will wrap this stuff all up with our whole top 10 takeaways from the NFL season from 2022. That'll be kind of like a combination of both videos if you guys want to stay tuned for that. And I'm also going to do a rookie recap from like a dynasty perspective on Monday so that we can talk about some of the guys that were like face planners, some of the guys that had great rookie seasons, who you should be investing in, who you should be selling, all that kind of stuff going forward. So if you enjoyed, as always, leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new, comment any of your thoughts down below. I'm going to post this, what we learned from every AFC team, and then Danny's what we learned from every NFC team to our Patreon. So if you guys want to check that out, we'll have that over there for you. We also are going to have tons of dynasty content this offseason, rookie write-ups, player cards, all that kind of stuff for the Tale of the Tape series that we did last year that you guys seem to really like. So stay tuned for that on patreon.com/fantasy stock exchange. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.
Wire me the money.